In my colleague and friend, Justice Correspondent David Spunt. He has been in contact with the Carter family. He joins us on the phone now. And David, you and I have talked about this back in the office in D.C. I've had the pleasure of meeting President Carter, but you had a very deep correspondence with him over years. You've interviewed him. Tell us about that.
Well, thanks for having me, Rich, and I'm sorry to hear this, and God bless Jimmy Carter. He lived quite a life, an impressive life, a long life, impacted many, many people, and he did it. He made it to 100, 1924 to 2024. I first met him almost 20 years ago. I was a reporter in Columbus, Georgia. That was my first job, and I was tasked with going down and covering a baseball game in Plains, Georgia, that he did every year with the local Plains baseball team and the Secret Service baseball team, and they played each other. And I remember I was there with my camera, and I asked him if I could talk to him, and he said, sure, no problem. And I'll never forget that it was hot, it was swampy, there were gnats everywhere crawling all over my face, crawling all over his face. It didn't bother him at all. Jimmy Carter's someone that went through decades and decades of living on a farm. He came to be the President of the United States. He chose to go back to be in Plains, Georgia. He's the only president that ever graduated from the United States Naval Academy, another impressive feat. And I think it was a couple of years after I met him, Rich. I want to say, yes, it was 2009. I met him in 2007, so almost 20 years ago. He gave me an hour-long interview at his boyhood home, and that's in Plains, Georgia. And it's the home where he grew up with his parents and his sister and his brother, and he was just so humble talking about his life and what always brought him back to Plains and why Plains was always there no matter where he went. He had dreams at one point in his life to go on and do other things. He studied over the naval genius, Admiral Hyman Rickover, and met so many people while he was in the Naval Academy, and obviously he became governor, and then he became president and truly could have done anything but said, you know what, I want to come back to Plains, Georgia after. He also, as you may have mentioned earlier, taught church, and this is something that comes out for many, many years at Maranatha Baptist Church, a church that he helped found. He, along with my friend Jan Williams and many other people, really just stayed humble and stayed with it in Plains, and everything was about Plains and the message and God and the importance of church and family and friends. And from what I remember, he would read the Bible in Spanish, in English, and he would always take time to stand there with his wife, the late Rosalind Carter, and take photographs with every person who wanted to at that church, and quite a gentleman. He'll be missed.
You know, David, you run into so many people who are in-demand interviews, former presidents and athletes, and often their time is pressed. Often they have large, retinues around them, and it's tough to really get to know them. When you were interviewing President Carter, what was it like? Were you able to get a sense of who he was? Could you do small talk with him? Did he ask about your family? What was he like to meet in person?
Very laid back, very informal, a gentleman, somebody that was well-read, somebody that knew who I was, where I was, what I did. He came to meet me at his boyhood home, and I was a young reporter, probably in my early 20s at the time, and to think that he took time out of his schedule to come meet with me, spend an hour with me and my former colleague, Phil Scoggins, at the time, and just to spend an hour, as I mentioned, my friend Jan Williams, who's been a longtime friend of the Carters, it really meant a lot to me that he did that. And when my daughter was born several years back, he signed a book for her. He was someone that always I stayed in touch with loosely. And he really, like I said, was the last generation of that World War II generation. His parents were born 1890s. I think his dad might have been late 1880s. His mother, Miss Lillian, lived till the early 1980s, if not 1980. And he always stayed true to his roots, and he always stayed true to Plains, and I think that really speaks a lot. I imagine being the former president of the United States and going back to your home, and he lived in a very modest-style home in Plains, Georgia, and that's where he wanted to live for the rest of his life, and that's where he and Rosalind did.
Yeah, I mean, he wrote dozens of books. He probably could have settled anywhere on the planet if he decided, but he decided to stay home. Talk a little bit about Rosalind and his relationship. They were married for 7+ decades. I mean, there really is, it seems to be in American political life, one of the most enduring marriages and relationships that have ever really been.
The way I understand it is that he and Rosalind Carter met when she was just a few months old in 1927. Think about that. And the reason I know that is, from what I understand, is that Miss Lillian Carter, Jimmy Carter's mother, was a nurse when Rosalind was an infant. And you have to remember Plains, Georgia in 1927, probably not a lot of people. So the story goes is that he met Rosalind when he was, 3 or 4 years old, and she was an infant. They obviously didn't connect till many, many years later. But the point is, that is someone that he saw, that he knew, her entire life, from when she was an infant until when she died, and she was always there by his side, an encouraging force, somebody that truly, said to him, if you want to go back to Plains, let's go back to Plains. And I met her and interviewed her at one point, and I remember, I'll never forget, she told me that after Jimmy Carter became president, she cried, and she said because she felt the world was safe because Jimmy Carter was president.
Wow. Well, David, we have about 90 seconds here before the top of the hour, and I just want to get your final thoughts as somebody who has had correspondence and met and interviewed Jimmy Carter on his life, on his legacy, and what that means to you and what it means to the country, really.
I'm just so impressed that Jimmy Carter is someone that became president of the United States, went to the Naval Academy, taught church, took the time to meet people, rode his bike around Plains. He was accessible. You got to know him. He Habitat for Humanity, building homes, the Carter Center, trying to eradicate different diseases, rare diseases around the world. I mean, this is someone that did not rest after he left the presidency. He could have left and gone into the shadows, and he stayed in the spotlight, not because it was about him. He stayed in the spotlight to help other people, and I think that's noble.
It's an absolutely remarkable legacy, and one that has really become the modern template for a post-presidency. And by the way, David, a template that hasn't really been equaled. So David Spunt, Justice Correspondent, thank you so much for joining us today, a day where President Jimmy Carter has died at the age of 100. Very much appreciated.